Today's a little bittersweet for me because we're putting a period on our long-suffering series through the book of Ephesians. I've loved every second of it. I hope you've loved some of it. But my heart is full because of where we are today and really where we're going to be these next few weeks together. But last week was fun because it felt a little old school because it was like, hello, the devil is real. He is out to destroy us, and yet our God is stronger, and he is inviting us to stand in Christ. And so it's almost as if the Apostle Paul is saying, I want you to appropriate everything that is available to you in this life, because this is a life of warfare. And the enemy of our soul, he's out to destroy us. And part of his scheme is to do battle against our minds. And so Paul is going to use the armor of God as sort of the backdrop to have this conversation about our mind, our thinking. And this is where we pick up today. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13. He says this: Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after you have done everything, to stand. So standing's the goal. That's what we've been talking about these last few weeks. With that in mind, listen to what else he says. Verse 14, he says, Stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all of this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and pray in the Spirit on all occasions with all kinds of prayers and requests. With this in mind, be alert and always keep on praying for all the Lord's people. So I think we can all agree, all of the armor of God is powerful, it's important, it's amazing in its own way. And I think we can say, yeah, we want to gird up our loins. If you want to use the King James, we want to gird up our loins with the belt of truth. We want to put on the breastplate of righteousness. We want to have the shield of faith with which we can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Yes to all of that. But what I want to do today, just for the sake of time, is I want to just talk about one piece of the armor that doesn't really get any press. And it's the one where he says, and take or put on the helmet of salvation. And so what Paul's going to do for us today is he's like, listen, if you want to be equipped for the day of evil, to use his language, if you and I want to be equipped against the schemes of the evil one, then we need to put on all the armor of God. But maybe most important, at the end of the day, if you want to protect your mind, then you need to put on the helmet of salvation. And the reason is the helmet of salvation protects our mind. And the way that we do battle with our minds is that we do that with the power of the gospel. Now, what I want to do to begin this conversation, I want to ask a weird question maybe for some of you. The question is this: are you sure you have a real relationship with God through his son, Jesus? Are you sure you have a real, abiding, sustaining, persevering, authentic, daily relationship with God through his son, Jesus? Now, for clarity, I'm not talking about those outside the church. I'm not talking about the thousands of people in our city currently that are like, yeah, not really into God, not really into Jesus. Cool, you're into Jesus? Great, amazing. Hope that works out for you, but not currently into Jesus. I'm not talking about them. Currently addressing those of you that have spent a lot of time in places like this. In Light of Stained Glass, maybe you were born in church. Maybe you were raised in church. Maybe you know a lot about church. But in quiet moments of your heart, in crisis in particular, you're like, am I sure? Am I really sure I've got a relationship with God that is sustaining, that is persevering? Do I really have a relationship with God through his son, Jesus? This matters to me because some of you know I grew up in a non-religious Jewish home, came to faith in high school, and immediately got connected to a youth group. And the youth group was amazing, but it had a camp culture. And what I mean by that is every summer we'd go to youth camp, and every winter we had winter camp, and we had spring camp. I mean, like, we were camped out. We were camp culture. And how many of you grew up kind of youth group culture, camp culture maybe? And how that would work is if you go to camp, every Friday night on youth camp is decision night. I mean, that's like where everybody cries, everybody goes to the altar, and there's usually a call for one of two decisions. One is the call to get saved. They want kids to get saved. Like kids to trust in Jesus, to have their sins forgiven, to have a destiny on their life, to be put in the family of God. Those are amazing moments. Kids get saved. But the other call was for kids to rededicate their life. And I look back on that season, those 4 years in high school, I probably rededicated my life like 50 times. Anybody else? Yeah, it's like definitely every camp, okay? I'm going and I'm like, today's the year. I'm rededicating again. And then maybe 7 or 8 times during the year, right? Because I'm a dumpster fire. Like truly. Was then, I am now. I'm like, it was a bad week. I need to go ahead and just re-up, raise my hand again, fill out the card, maybe get rebaptized. I don't know. I mean, like, I'm feeling it. You never know. So like, I'm rededicating all over the place. And it's funny because it's true, but it's not funny when that begins to drift into Christian adulthood. And what I mean by that is the scheme of the enemy, I think one of his primary schemes is to do battle against our mind. And his primary scheme in our mind is to get us to doubt. To doubt what? To doubt the promises of God. Primarily the primary promise of God. And the primary promise of God is this, is that if you and I will trust in Jesus, like as our substitute, as the one that loves us, the one that has paid the debt for us, if we'll trust in Jesus, the promise is that God will forgive us. And he'll restore us, and he'll reconcile us to heaven, and he'll put us in a family. And no matter what, lovingly, he'll call us son and daughter. But the enemy is out to get you and I to doubt that. To doubt all of the promises, but particular that promise. And this is why Paul is so adamant. He's like, you need to put on the helmet of salvation because you're in a battle. There's real warfare. And I want you to I want you to work against, in a warfare kind of way, against the schemes of the devil. And you do that by the power of the gospel. Let me show you what I mean. This idea is so beautiful for lots of reasons. One of the reasons this idea of our mind and putting on the helmet of salvation is powerful is because some of you maybe have heard this, if you maybe work in academic settings. You've probably heard, okay, if you're going to be a follower of Jesus, then you just need to go and check your brain at the door. Anybody ever hear that? You need to check your brain, check your mind, check your intellect, your thinking. You need to check that at the door. I was like, oh, you believe in Jesus? Oh, do you also believe in the tooth fairy? Because, thinking, logical kind of people really don't go in for this kind of thing. And so, yeah, you're going to need to check your brain, check your thinking, check your intellect at the door. And I just want to contend with you. You don't have to check your brain. In fact, do not check your brain or your intellect at the door. In fact, this is why I'm so excited. In 5 weeks, it sounds like a long way away, but 5 weeks we're starting a brand new series through the book of James. And one of the early ideas in the book of James is that you can take the gospel, take Jesus, take the Bible, and you can put it under the microscope of your scrutiny. They can handle it. And so the idea of our mind and robust thinking and our logic are not just permitted in the church, they're actually invited into our worship of God. And Paul understands this when he says this in Romans 10. Verse 10, and this is right before a really famous verse some of you probably heard where he says, anyone that calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. But listen to what he says sort of as a precursor to that. He says, it is with your heart and you are justified, and with your mouth that you confess and are saved. So the heart, when he's talking about the heart in the New Testament, it's almost always in reference to the driver's seat of the human. Like that's when we, even people that are not Christians, we talk about the heart, like following your heart. And the Bible references the heart, but it's the heart that drives the person. And the heart usually in the Bible references our mind, our will, and our emotions. And the reason that matters is that when you begin a relationship with Jesus, it almost always starts in the mind. That's where belief starts, right? You engage your mind, and then it quickly goes to your emotions. Right, should, right? If you're you're an emotionless Christian, you're probably not a Christian. Like our emotions should be tapped in. Our emotions should be engaged in our faith. So it begins with our mind, it connects to our heart, our emotions, and then quickly it should engage our will. Our will is how we obey. Jesus says, if you love me, With your heart, you will obey me. So our will engages in the commandments of God. Okay, and so Paul is not opposed to our mind. In fact, he's like, no, I love your mind. That's why you should protect your mind. And the mind is part of our worship experience. The second reason this matters, the idea of our mind and putting on the helmet of salvation, is that one of the schemes of the enemy that I find in engaging our mind and doing battle against our mind is that he wants to confuse our relationship with God. And he does that usually through questions. You see this in the garden. What does he do with Adam and Eve? He asks questions. And one of the questions that often I find he asks is, how do you know you're worthy enough? I mean, we talk about the gospel and the beauty and the love of Christ, and all of a sudden we feel very small, and we're like, I don't know, am I worthy? And the enemy comes in, he's like, are you worthy? How do you know you're worthy? And immediately, maybe, if you've got the peace of mind to quote Romans, 10 back to him and be like, no, anybody that calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. And he's like, I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about Jesus. And he's like, yeah, I know Jesus, but are you worthy? Are you worthy for this thing? And again, we're like, no, this is not about me, this is about Jesus. And the devil's going to be like, listen, I know what Jesus did, but I also know what you did last night or last weekend or last year. Like, I know, so like, are you worthy of this? And honestly, I've been walking with God just long enough where I actually like that question. It's a good reminder for me because I'm not. And you're not. And you'll never be worthy on your own. And so when the devil comes, he's like, are you worthy? I'm like, no, I'm not worthy. When the devil comes, he's like, did you get it right? I'm like, no, I didn't get it right. Jesus got it right. The other question that he likes to ask, and this is often for younger Christians, not always, but often, is he'll be like, you've done too much. How do you know you haven't done too much? And it's always associated around like, how many times are you going to ask for forgiveness for the same thing? How many times, or do you need a second chance? How many times are you going to keep blowing it? I mean, how deep is this well of grace? I mean, eventually it's going to dry up for you. And so how do you know you haven't done too much? And then my favorite question that he asks to confuse our relationship with God, this is the silly one. This is the one that I think he only asks American Christians because somehow we've invented this. But he says, how do you know the prayer worked? Do you everybody know what I'm talking about, the prayer? Just more than 6 of you. So everybody, the prayer. He's like, how do you know the prayer worked? Because he's like, I know you prayed it, but how do you know the prayer worked? Because like when you prayed the prayer, did you get a ticket? Did he hand it through a window when you put your magical quarter in the slot and he gave you the ticket? And when you get into eternity, presumably welcomed by St. Peter, you give him the ticket. Did that happen? No, that didn't happen. Well, how do you know the prayer worked? Well, I know it worked because I said, Lord, would you forgive me? And he's like, well, cool. Well, how do you know you weren't supposed to pray, Lord, forgive thou? Or Lord, forgive thee? Like, how do you know the only prayers that God answers are in the King James English? How do you know that? Well, you don't know that. So how do you know your prayer worked? Again, it's funny because it's sort of true. But it's not funny because we have an enemy that is constantly doubling down on crippling our confidence in the promise of God. And he's like, are you worthy enough? Did you do too much? Did you do it? And this is why why don't you go to Romans chapter 5. We're going to turn the corner here. I love this passage. If you're new to the Bible or you're investigating faith, Romans is sort of the opus of Paul's writings. And if you want an apologetic of like why Jesus matters and why Jesus is the only way to heaven and the only way to a life of flourishing, Romans is where you're going to want to live. But Romans 5, this is what he says. Verse 1, he says, therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So watch how this works. Verse 2 says, through whom, so whom is Jesus? Through Jesus, we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand, and we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Okay, let's read that again. That was very wordy. There's a lot going on, but let's just unpack this. He says, therefore, since we have been justified. Okay, what does justified mean? Justified means that Jesus did the work. Like Jesus is the one that took our place. And what that means is Jesus gives us his life and he takes our death. Jesus takes our sin and we receive forgiveness. Jesus gives us his righteousness and he takes our unrighteousness. And because of that, we're justified. That's a legal term. We're justified now before the Creator. We're justified before our Heavenly Father, okay? Look at verse 2. Let's keep going. He says, through whom, through Jesus, we have gained access. Access to what? Access to heaven. Access to forgiveness. Access to flourishing. Access to a future. Through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. Okay, so what's happening is that Jesus got it right for us. We didn't have to get it right. Jesus got it right. Jesus did what he came to do. He obeyed. He fulfilled the law. He put himself in harm's way for you and for me. And the reason this matters so much is because when the enemy comes to you, and hello, he will come to you. When he comes to you and he's like, how do you know? How do you know you can have confidence? How do you know the promise of God is true for you? How do you know? The worst answer you can give is, well, I prayed a prayer when I was 9 years old. Bad answer. I know that because, again, some of you, you know my story. Had no religious experience, grew up in a non-religious Jewish home, got radically saved when I was 14. Met Jesus. In fact, for about a year, I had some friends sharing Jesus, sharing the message of Jesus, grace, hope, forgiveness, sonship, all of it. And then they invited me to an event. And I went to the event as a non-Christian, and I heard the gospel again. And it was like grace exploded in my heart. I mean, my eyes were opened, and the Spirit rushed in, and it was a moment. And it was the most important moment of my life. And then I had to leave that event, right? Because, that wasn't like a forever event. I had to leave the event and go live as a 14-year-old. And I don't know if you know many 14-year-olds, but they're messes. And so I had to leave and go live my life and try to figure out what it means to follow Jesus as a 14-year-old. And maybe a year later, the enemy is kind of my first experience with the enemy. The enemy comes in, he's like, how do you know? Like, you're a mess. Hello, you are terminally inconsistent. How do you know? How do you know? How do you know? And so what I would do as a 15-year-old is I would point back to my 14-year-old self, and I'd be like, well, I remember. I literally remember. Remember the place, the time, the deal, the prayer, raise my hand, remember getting baptized. It was amazing. It was an incredible moment. And so I just point back to when I was 14. But then I went out to college, and I was a regular college student, following Jesus, but there were lots of times in my college experience where I was doing lots of things that clearly dishonoring God. And in doing that, I created dark spaces in my life. And it's the dark spaces that are an invitation to the enemy. If you're wondering, why is the enemy at work in my life? In part, it's because you've created dark spaces. It's because you've created opportunity for him to come in and be like, hello, this is where I love to live. I love darkness. And so I had these little dark spaces in my life that nobody else knew about. And he'd come in and be like, you're a mess. You're proclaiming Jesus, talking about Jesus, but look at you. You're a freaking mess. You're the worst. How do you know? And in my mind, I would point back to when I was 14, but the problem is I've got a terrible memory. I do not remember what I prayed when I was 14. I'm like, I remember where I was, sort of, maybe. Don't remember what I prayed when I was 14. And then I got married a few years later, and marriage is hard. And kids are hard, and life is hard, and we're trying to follow Jesus, and we're like, it's hard though, and we're making a mess of it, and there's some dark spots, and the enemy would come in and be like, you guys are the worst. How do you know? Seriously, how do you know? And I would point back to my 14-year-old self, but I'm like, man, I don't think I can trust the 14-year-old version of John Quitt. I can barely trust the 29-year-old version of John Quitt. Like, I don't know, how do I trust that? Like, how do I know he got it right back then, right? And then I go to church, and the pastor would often say things like this: if you died tonight, where would you spend eternity? Of course, my first thought's like, why is everybody dying at night? Like, what about the guy that dies before lunch? Where's he going, right? But I understood what he was talking about. He's like, how do you know? How can you have assurance? How do you know? And I was like, okay, let me point back to my 14-year-old self. Like, I did something when I was 14 years old. But when I was in college, something did happen. I got connected to a church, and as a young adult, I'm going to church for the first time on my own. No other. I come to Tuscaloosa. I'm not from here. Go to this church. I've got some people coming around me. I'm getting discipled. So why discipleship matters. And I'm engaging my mind for the first time in my faith. I'm reading some books, and it was the first time that I was able to see the depth and the height and the width and the breadth of the gospel, like the implications for the life, the death, and the resurrection for me. Like, it was way bigger than I ever thought. It's way bigger. And what that did for me, it did several things, but one of the things it did for me is that when the enemy came to me and he was like, how do you know? How do you know you got it right? I could immediately say, I didn't get it right. I'm not going to get it right. I'm never going to get it right, but Jesus got it right for me. In fact, theologically, what I realized, and if you're into this kind of thing, is technically speaking, I got saved 2,000 years ago. I know I look good for my age, but I got saved 2,000 years ago because 2,000 years ago was when Jesus decided to go to the cross for me. When Jesus decided to lay down all of his rights and go to the cross and take my sin and my shame and my guilt and the wrath of God on himself, and in some very real way, my name was on his lips. And so I got saved 2,000 years ago, and somehow supernaturally it caught up with me 2,000 years later to my 14-year-old heart. And that's when my heart burst open with grace. And the point is simply this, is that when the enemy comes to you and he's like, how do you know? How do you know you got it right? How do you know you're worthy? How do you know? And you can just say, this is not about me. This is about Jesus. It's not about what I've done. It's about what he's done. It's not about anything I'm going to do. It's everything about what he's already accomplished on my behalf. And so I can have confidence, not because of anything I did. I can have confidence because of what Jesus has done, and my faith is tethered to it. This is why Paul is so adamant. Put on the helmet of salvation. Put on the helmet of salvation. Put on the helmet of salvation. And the reason is that when the enemy does come, and he will come, in your weakest moments, he will come. In your most failed moments, he will come. And he's going to say, how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? And in those moments, you can say, you're such a chump. Listen, it's such a tiring argument. Just zip your lip, go bother somebody else. Because I know that one drop of blood from Jesus can change an entire generation. Because he's changed my heart. So here's what I want to do.